Greetings, friends. My name is Pavel Stelmach, and today in the UATV studio we have Dr. Greta Uehling, PhD in anthropology, University of Michigan. So, Mrs. Greta, let me start our interview with the acknowledgement of your hard work. You traveled all across Ukraine at more than 4,000 kilometers from north to east and south. And the first question, what impacted you the most? What experience in Ukraine made you write the book and it became the pillar of your scientific work?
Well, the book is really an intervention into how we think about war. And I think that what made the most significant impact on me and my vision of the war began to shift when I met a humanitarian named Kirillo. Actually, that's a pseudonym. He compared the levels of risk in different parts of Ukraine to the colors of the stoplight, showing me how at the time I was doing my research, at least, the war entailed very planned and willed destruction, but it was also more variable across the country than I had originally imagined. And I think that another person who really sparked my interest was a woman that in the book I call Makila. She fled after she had been placed on a blacklist. And in some ways, she conformed to what we already know about war, which is that it entails profound losses, right? She had to flee in the course of about 20 minutes. But she also changed my thinking because in some of the most difficult moments of her life, support was abundantly available to her, and a neighbor helped her escape. And her story is partly about loss, but I think it's also about recovery that showed me there are complexities to war that really need to be given more attention. And it's really those complexities that I talk about.
Okay, thank you. And the war, Russian-Ukrainian war, it has impacted people in Ukraine, Russia, all around the world. Since 2014, families even stopped talking, communicating with each other because of different views. But in 2022, it became obvious to absolutely everyone who is the aggressor here and who is waging war of aggression. What do you think should be changed in the media representation of the Russian-Ukrainian war in the West, in Europe, in Ukraine maybe, because media, they influence the representation and the human consciousness, how they perceive the conflict and the war that is right now ongoing.
hmm hmm Yes, well, I think that the media in America have come a long way in representing Ukraine respectfully. Fortunately, the old view of Ukraine as a satellite or so-called little brother to Russia is rapidly changing. Um, and as you mentioned, with the full-scale invasion, many people in the West really opened their eyes to the wealth and power and the creativity and intelligence of Ukrainians. I think one thing that would be very helpful to change is that, I find the surprise that Americans express about Ukrainian resilience and fortitude in the face of Russian aggression really reflects a tendency to underestimate the country. And so, of course, from a more Ukrainian perspective or vantage point, the robust response to Russian aggression is much less surprising, right? The country faces an existential threat, and so it is natural that they would launch such a robust response to it. I think also another thing that I'd like to point out is that the nomenclature for the war is still somewhat fluid. Scholars debate whether it's better referred to as war in Ukraine or war on Ukraine. And as you're probably aware that for a long time, UN agencies did not recognize the aggression in the Donetsk and Luhansk republics as war. It was treated as a conflict, and I'm clear that it was, is, and must always be called a war. But international and intergovernmental organizations have really only very recently recognized this.
Okay. Uh, Maybe you see the massive Russian zombie TV propaganda as a response to that, as the key, because we remember the World War II time German Nazi propaganda when many people in the civilized country of Germany supported the aggression and for many years supported the evil regime. What do you think of the current mass Russian propaganda and its influence on the UN and international organizations, including?
Well, in the book, I talk about how the people that I interviewed, and I did about 150 interviews over a 3-year period across Ukraine. I talk about how they recognized what they called the zombification of their friend and family members as a result of misinformation and disinformation. And one of the things that I explore in the book is how this led to tensions because people no longer had the same frames of reference. They no longer inhabited the same informational spaces. And that made understanding one another much more difficult. In the book, I discuss 2 strategies for dealing with this. Some people severed their relationships, deciding that they could no longer agree with people who had been overly in what they perceived to be as just completely overly influenced by Russian state media. And in these cases, friendships and family relationships became casualties of the conflict. But there were other people who sought to minimize those political differences and those influences from the media. And those individuals tended to see their friends and their relatives as victims of Russian media misinformation and disinformation. And these individuals tended to preserve their relationships, but of course, it came at a tremendous cost. Because they could no longer speak about things that were tremendously significant. So I think that, to summarize, one danger is that people occupying different information spaces find it difficult to understand, trust, and believe one another. Related to that, as a very practical matter, this will complicate the efforts to deoccupy territory in the future. But
So,
there's a second danger that is that, people who are not given, people who don't have an accurate or holistic understanding of what's going on in their country are obviously going to be less in a position to elect suitable leaders or advocate for reasonable policies. And so ultimately, they're both relational and geopolitical implications for misinformation and disinformation.
so it is the war of narratives in the first place, the narrative that is inflicted on the population. It makes it easier for the aggressor to wage its aggression. And one of the last questions, the maybe most horrific event of this war is mass kidnapping of Ukrainian children from Ukrainian Donbas, which you have visited, and Russians are trying to erase their national identity by changing their names and start making them study Russian political studies in faraway regions, transporting them away from their parents. What do you think of this criminal policy and what you can compare this to?
Yes, well, removing children from their country is part of the definition of genocide according to the 1948 convention. And basically, making Ukrainian children become Russian prevents their families from passing on Ukrainian language and culture. I think these removals are part of a deliberate attempt to, change the identities of the survivors of the war. And this relates directly to what I describe in the book, because now that Russia is removing children against their families' wishes, the true significance of relationships is even more clear. My book delves into relationships directly to show how they matter. They matter because war and genocide reorganizes personal lives. And although relationships are usually treated as backdrops or tangents, I think that put succinctly, Russia is attempting to destroy Ukraine both militarily with its military might, but also from within, right? From the inside out by destroying families. And that's what I kind of like about the cover of this book, because it tries to say that the images flowing across our television screens are painfully familiar. And what I try to do in the book is provide a vision of the world of the war from the outside in. Because one thing that's for certain is that the everyday kind of war that I describe in the book, it's really two things. Part of it is the conscious and creative ways that non-combatants engaged war to defend their country. But there's also a way in which a less obvious dimension, which is that relationships were so profoundly affected. And I think that really this everyday war is distinguished by its objective, right? The people who engaged in this were interested in preserving their country and preserving their caring connections.
Thank you very much. The last question, maybe do you have a concise answer? If we have everyday war in Ukraine, between Ukrainian social groups and maybe some people that are still on the Russian-occupied territory, including Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk, how do you see the everyday peace? What will be after the end of the war? I believe that the occupation of those territories, how to make the inner peace of civilians between themselves.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, that's a very good question. A few minutes ago, I described a couple different strategies, and I think that when the territory is deoccupied, it will be a long and also a delicate process, because something that has been learned from other wars is that it's fairly straightforward to rebuild infrastructure, and plans can be made for that, but it's a much more delicate process to repair the interpersonal ruins that have been created by the relocation of children, the fracturing of relationships. And so this will be at the forefront of the work that international and local humanitarian organizations carry out. And I really believe that Ukrainians are themselves best positioned to know what's most helpful and what's not helpful. And I interacted with dozens of humanitarians, and I was continually very moved by their abilities to respond to the needs within Ukraine.
This was Greta Uehling, PhD in anthropology of the University of Michigan, with her relevant and straightforward work, Everyday War, about Ukrainian civilians suffering the horrors of war every day since 2014 till now. Thank you for staying with us and subscribe to UATV English.